Hello everyone, I hope this video finds you well. If you've ever wanted your users to search your content by meaning rather than exact keywords, or you're building an AI-powered app that needs to retrieve relevant context from your database, then I've got something for you. Payload CMS Vectorize is a plugin that lets you add semantic search and RAG capabilities to your Payload CMS. Payload CMS Vectorize is really straightforward. It relies on PG Vector, which lets you store your vectors in Postgres. Payload CMS Vectorize allows for you to plug in your own AI provider, has real-time ingestion and bulk ingestion. VectorDB is an enterprise-level feature offered by Payload CMS Inc., which I help you get for free. For free, I also give you this video. With that said, you can contact me at techenabler@JDDominguez if you want more personalized help. Here's what we'll cover in this video: installing the plugin and setting up PG Vector, configuring a knowledge pool with chunking and embedding in real time, seeing real-time vectorization in action, performing semantic searches via the API. There's a part 2 for later. Look at the README for details, restrictions, and requirements. All right, if you're ready, then I'm ready. Let's begin. I've got here a new cursor. Let's go into a clean folder and start a new Payload CMS project. Has to be Postgres. I've got my Docker already running, so I'm actually gonna turn this one down. Okay, let's open the project. Okay, so these are the collections we get right out the box: pages, posts, media, categories, users, redirects, forms, and form submissions, search results. As you can see, there's no vector database. So let's get started by adding our first vector database. To install, we do pnpm add payload CMS Vectorize. Now the first thing we need to do is create an integration. The integration is kind of complex, but it'll be worth it. So the plugin configuration has two parts: the static config and the dynamic config. Each config designs knowledge pools. A knowledge pool is a DB vector table. You can, of course, have an infinite number of knowledge pools. This right here, though, what we're about to do, that fits in here, is a static config. The static config is a database tables configuration. It allows you to configure the number of dimensions for your vectors. It also allows you to set the indices, which helps with search speed. Any change in the static config needs a migration. So first, let's define our knowledge pool. So main knowledge pool. That's it. That's all it takes. And let's add dims. Of course, for production, you want to use a dimensions that actually make sense. Let's say for Voyage AI's light model, it's 1024. But that's not necessary for right now. The next thing you want to do is tell it how many indices you want. There's two rule of thumbs I go by. The first rule of thumb is you do the square root of the number of vectors you'll have. And the second rule of thumb is you do the number of vectors divided by 1,000. The best way to know for sure is to do testing. Nonetheless, this means that if you have a very large database, you should have lots of indices. Since we're just doing dev, I'm going to set it to 1. Okay. Now, with this said, this usually takes a migration for production, but for development, there's no need to do any migration. With that said, if you do no migrations, you'll never have any indices, which is fine for development because we won't have that many vectors. So with this here, we've added our first knowledge pool. The next thing we got to do is plug in the changes in the Postgres adapter. So firstly, you must add the extension vector. This adds PG vector. The second thing you must do is add the after schema init. It comes from the Vectorize integration. Now we're going to add the dynamic config. Like I mentioned earlier, the dynamic config does not need you to do any migrations. Now we get to the meat of the plugin, the dynamic config. The dynamic config sets up the runtime behavior. Firstly, you need to state what collections you want to vectorize as part of this knowledge pool. You should pool the vectors according to their use cases. All similar things that would be queried together should be grouped together. For example, if you have a customer service bot, then you might be querying across various collections. If you have a developer helper bot, you might be querying across just the document collection. Now, with that said, in our use case, we're just going to do posts. Now, it's one of these, Now, that means whenever a new post is added to it, it'll actually trigger. Or when the post is modified, it'll also trigger the after, change hooks. And it'll actually run the embeddings. So every collection gets its own function for chunking, okay? So every collection has its own method for how it should be chunked. The most important part is to split the document into useful pieces for querying. The plugin returns the doc ID when you query, so you can always query on the doc later. The plugin also returns a chunk text you can set up to store and return any other field on query. So because it's ran on the after change and after add hook, you'll get the doc and the payload. So in this case, all we want to do is return just the doc.title. And, to show extension fields and that you can return anything, we'll just say this is an extension field text. Okay. Let's see what it's complaining for. Okay, so we still have a lot more to add. The next thing to add here is extension fields. So as I mentioned before, you can actually return any kind of field that you want. In this case, we're going to return, and this is an extension field of type text. This will actually be queryable. You can do where queries on this. So not only can you do the semantic search, but you can do where queries on the extension fields. Okay. The next thing you actually need, extension fields are optional, is the embedding config. The embedding config has lots of things that are necessary, including, first and foremost, the version. For this, we'll just do v1. So the version is extremely useful for knowing whenever you've done any changes to the dynamic config. If you do any changes to the dynamic config, you're probably going to want to re-embed everything, and the version helps you keep track of that. Okay. So besides the version, the next thing to add is the query function. Query function is, of course, a very important function that's used to embed the user supplied query. I'm not sure why the AI gave me this, because it's not that. It's actually like this. Now, let me show you guys kind of what a real Voyage AI embed query function looks like. So this is using Vercel's AI. They have a function called embed. You'll tell it that you'll be using the model from Voyage. And in this case, we were using the 3.5 Lite. And you let it know that it's a type of query, right? But in this case, we won't be using this because this is just for show. Instead, we're going to be using a dummy embed query, which does a very good job of giving the right shape. So let's use this. We said 8, correct? At this point, we now have all necessary items for querying, and the plugin will not error out. We can actually run it and see what our collections look like. So let's run it. As you can see, we got new collections, okay? So the first two you'll see are the vector bulk embedding runs and the vector bulk embedding batches. These are very useful for when you're actually running bulk embeddings. We'll get to that in part 2 of the video. For now, I want to bring you to our main knowledge pools. Payload, for some reason, adds an S at the end, but it's just your main knowledge pool. So you can see there's an error here, okay? This happens because it's missing the embed all button, and that's because we have to do an import map. So let's do that real quick. Generate import map. You only have to do this one time after adding the plugin. Let's refresh. So the import added this bulk embed all button. As you can see, bulk embedding is not configured. That'll be done in part 2. For now, what we can see is that we have this knowledge pool and there are no vectors in it. So let's get into making vectors. let's stop the server and let's do an embed documents. So here in embedding config, as you can see, there's other functions that we can add, particularly this real-time ingestion function. It expects an embed docs function, which takes a string, an array of strings, and it returns the vectors, right? So let me show you what a real Voyage AI would look like. So here we would be using Vercel's AI's embed mini instead of the embed. Okay, this is because whenever you're embedding a single doc, unlike a query, it returns many chunks to embed. If you call this embed too many times too quickly, you will be rate limited by Voyage AI. So Vercel AI gives us a very handy function called embed mini, where it'll group all your embeddings and let you embed them all at once. Yeah. And we can see how we would be returning the embedding results. With that said, we will be using a fake embed docs, and we have it right here. Real-time ingestion. Okay. So right here, we have most of the plugin piped, except for the fact that the plugin relies on jobs and we have no jobs running. The real-time ingestion is by default running on the default queue. So let's set up the default queue. So here, we'll add auto run. And we want it to be a cron job. And we want it to run every 5 seconds. Oops. Let's give it a limit. Just, let's say 10 at once. And actually, we don't actually have to give it the name because it's by default. With this setup, you now have real-time ingestions. This is great for new projects. Let's try. So here we'll be adding a new post. This is, of course, the default Payload CMS where it keeps just saving on any kind of change. With that said, though, we should have some vectors already in here. And as we can see, we do. So let's do a query. Let's open up a new terminal. We can do a curl post http local host 3000. Now by default it sets the vector search at this API point. With that said, I did put it so that you can modify it. Of course, the content is application JSON, and this is what we will be querying. Let's take a look. Hi everyone, I am back. So what happened was that I wasn't giving a very good 500 error. I've now changed that. You can see the change in 0.5.2. Let me show you what it looks like now when you mess up, right? It tells you the actual error. And it was just an ingestion error, so ta-da! You now have semantic search, which is fantastic. As I mentioned before, the plugin at this stage is great for new projects, but older projects need an embed all function that I'll introduce in the next video. In the next video, I'll show you briefly how to use the bulk embedding feature for backfilling existing content and how to run migrations. Thank you very much. I hope you find the plugin useful.